Hello, YouTube. This is Christian Idealism. I'm going to today. We're going to do a different video. And by anyone, so I'm not going to be talking to anyone. I'm just going to be presenting my testimony of how I came to Christianity and how I ultimately accepted idealism. So let me just screen share real quick. Okay, hold on. Let me check, making sure it's all right. It's online. All right. So let's start off with the beginning. My deconversion originally. So I had been a Christian my whole life until around this is really outdated, but it was around last year. And again, this is outdated, so it wasn't actually last year. It was more like 2 years ago. But anyways, I came around the interaction problem. The interaction problem severely challenged my faith. I'll explain what the interaction problem is, but it really once you understand it, you realize it's really a problem. You can understand why I had to eventually reject Christianity, because that's what I thought it taught. Anyways, before idealism, I was a dualist, obviously. Dualism is the belief that mind and matter are completely separate substances and exist independently of each other. And so this view is the mainstream view of God and the soul in the Western church. So like Protestants, I don't know about Catholics, but I'm assuming most Catholics would be substance dualists as well. So this is pretty much the mainstream view. This is what you're taught. I mean, they don't call it dualism, but they say, they do teach that, the world is, quote unquote, materially real in a sense. So yeah, it is a mainstream view. So these are different positions. Now, this isn't all the positions, obviously. We're only going to be going over property dualism, substance dualism, physicalism, and idealism. Neutral monism is kind of, that could actually work with my view anyway, so we're not going to really go over that because it's not really relevant. So, okay, so substance dualism faces the interaction problem. And the interaction problem is how it's possible for immaterial things such as the mind can have material effects on things such as the brain. This caused me to doubt God being able to create the world, since, God is typically thought of as an immaterial being that interacts with the quote-unquote material world. But once you understand the interaction problem, or once I understood the interaction problem, I realized that this was a really big problem. And so I had to reject God. I had to become an atheist, obviously, because I didn't think God could ever interact with the world, and therefore I assumed matter. And so I say, well, okay, well, if the immaterial doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist, and therefore God, Christianity is false, so I became an atheist. Okay, so now my reconversion from Scripture. So here I'm not going to present any quote-unquote evidence, just deriving Christianity from purely Scripture. So for those that are skeptical of idealism because it's not in Scripture, well, I'm going to present why it is in Scripture. So you first have Acts 17, which says God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some poets have said, so what that means, if we take that to mean literally, for him we live and move and have, in him, that sounds like we're in his mind, right? That doesn't sound like, that sounds very idealistic, where we're in God's mind, essentially. And then it says in Colossians, it says, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Again, that whole idea that, we're in God's mind makes perfect sense. And then by faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen is not made of what was visible. So basically, just the idea that the world was not created from matter, but rather it's made of information. Next is John 1:3. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made. So what this means is that through Christ the world was created, essentially. And then we have Hebrews, which in the last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed here to all things, and throughout whom he has also made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. Again, that word sustaining, which would mean we depend on him. After he had provided purification for sins, he said. So basically, again, this idea that we depend on God, even our being depends on him. So it's not that we depend on him in a spiritual sense, but we literally depend on him for existence. Okay, so the Greek word for word in John is the logos, and Neoplatonism is the one. And then, of course, this goes back into the whole what that means and how it relates to idealism. So, okay, so in Christianity, idealism in Christianity currently it's taught in the Eastern Orthodox Church. It is mainly in the essence-energy distinction, which is mostly called weak pantheism, but they don't really call it that. And then, for those that are unaware, pantheism is the belief that God is the universe. However, pantheism says that the universe is in God, but God transcends the universe. And then you have two different views on that, which is strong pantheism and weak pantheism. What I'm promoting here is weak pantheism. I'm not a strong pantheist, just so you guys know. I'm a weak pantheist. And that doesn't mean that God's weak. It means weak in the sense the doctrine, as in pantheism itself, is not, there's still a distinction between the creator and the created. And then finally, the theistic idealist is Bishop Berkeley, Jonathan Edwards, and Keith Ward. So yeah, that's pretty much idealism in Christianity. I was going to go over the soul, but I didn't make a slide for that. Anyways, let's move on. So for this, you have explanatory continuity. How is it that an immaterial God can't logically relate to a material universe? And so in order for God to exist, the universe has to be idealistic. And this isn't necessarily an argument for idealism. This is just showing that if in order for God to exist, idealism has to be true. And so really, ultimately, theism or theology presupposes idealism in the first place. So, there's really no like if you're a theist, you believe in God, it's to be an idealist than to be a dualist. So that's the model we get that's Christian Neoplatonism, and that's kind of the whole idea. Now we're going to move on to the philosophy of mind. So in consciousness, we have different views on what consciousness is. So physicalism is only physical substance exists and mental substance emerges or reduces to it. This is the view of most atheists. Substance dualism, of course, is only the physical and mental exist, but they are both irreducible. So yes, there is physical, but then there's also mental, and they don't depend on each other. They just, they're both fundamental. And then property dualism, which is only physical substance exists, but there is mental and physical properties. And so, yeah, it's still monism in the sense that there's only one substance, but then there's mental and physical. So there's still a distinction. It's just, it's kind of like the mental is glued on to the physical. And then finally, we have idealism, which is only mental substance exists and physical substance emerges or reduces from it. So, yeah. And then, so now we're going to start off with the philosophical objections to physicalism. So first of all is Cartesian skepticism. Now, this isn't necessarily an argument against physicalism. It's just pointing out the epistemic problems with it. So in Cartesian skepticism, we can doubt the material world. Okay, so I'm sitting down at my desk right now. I can doubt that the outside world is real, but what I can't doubt is my mind, because if I doubted my mind, the very fact that I'm doubting something proves that, the mind exists. So therefore, if our minds were material, then we could, we should be able to doubt them. But the fact that we can't doubt our minds, then it would make more sense to say that our minds are not material, just by the fact that the outside world, just the fact that we can doubt the material, but we can't necessarily doubt the immaterial, it would make more sense to say that the mind is not material on epistemic grounds. Okay, now the next argument is the Mary color scientist. So Mary has total knowledge of the color red, but has never seen the color red. But she understands the physical effects of red, but she never actually experienced red. So the next day she leaves the room and experiences the color red. Her experience of something she did not know before, so the experience of red is immaterial. Now, again, this isn't really necessarily, I mean, yeah, it is an argument against physicalism, but it's more of like an epistemic argument, you know, so. Next argument is the philosophical zombies. We can conceive of a material body, a p-zombie, that's what it's mostly referred to, a p-zombie, but I just wanted to get the full word out there so that people don't get confused, that behaves conscious but isn't. Thus, whatever consciousness is, it cannot be something, it must be something additional to the material body. So, you know, you could have a being that acts conscious, but in reality isn't conscious, and therefore consciousness is not material. It has to be something additional to matter. Thus, consciousness is immaterial. And so, typically, the response most physicalists try to argue is, well, if you just add more brains to it, then you know you should be able to get consciousness. But you know that's kind of a non sequitur. So, anyways, moving on now. So the Chinese room argument. So this is mainly an argument against functionalism. This isn't an argument against physicalism, so to speak, but it is an argument against a form of physicalism. So a man in a room manipulates Chinese symbols using an instruction book through syntactic processes and formulates responses. Right? This is how computers. This is how artificial intelligence work and whatnot. The catch, though, is that he doesn't understand Chinese in a semantic way. Like if I were to lock myself in a room and a bunch of Chinese symbols are going through, I'm not going to understand what the Chinese symbols say, but the very fact that I don't understand it, but yet I can communicate from someone outside the room as if it looks like I really understand it, then therefore the consciousness cannot be a process in the same way. Because a lot of physicalists try to argue that consciousness is like a process in the brain, where you know it's just software, and the consciousness is software of the brain, just how the software on computers is a process. Well, this argument pretty much shows that consciousness cannot be a process of the brain. So yeah, and then finally we have the hard problem of consciousness. This is the objective/subjective gap. So the idea is that this kind of goes back to the philosophical zombies, but it gets into more detail on it. So science only studies things that are from an objective perspective. So like I'm sitting on my desk right now, I'm not going to say that my wooden desk has subjective experience, right? I mean, that wouldn't make, no one would say a piece of wood has subjective consciousness. I mean, some people might, but most people aren't, like most physicalists aren't going to say that, And then also we have qualia, which is an irreducible mental substance, since taste, color, smell, seeing things, that doesn't exist with physical substance. And what that means basically is that what we see and what we experience that's not physical, that's mental, because we have minds, and so we would experience the world mentally. Even if the world were quote unquote physical, it doesn't matter, we still experience the world mentally. Thus, the mind is an irreducible mental substance. And the reason why is because if you look at the color red, for example, if you reduce that, you're not going to find a bunch of neurons going off in there. And when you introspect, you're not going to get a bunch of neurons. I mean, there's no way that you can get a bunch of neurons going off. It doesn't matter how hard you try. There's no way that you're going to be able to reduce the color red or the conscious experience to a bunch of neurons going off in your head. You can't. That's not how consciousness works. So, again, I don't want to go into much detail. I know this might sound confusing to some people, but that's basically the problem. If you want to do more research, then you can do that, but that's basically the problem. So to present the main problem here is, so you have phenomenal consciousness, and then you have functional consciousness. So the functional side, that's what neuroscience does. So everything below this red line, that's the quote unquote easy problems. But then the hard problem is, how do you get from the brain to the color red, right? So down here is the easy problems. This is what neuroscience does, but neuroscience does not do this. It does not. sorry about that, does not go, it doesn't address the hard problem. And so that's kind of the big issue. Now, most physicalists will try to say there is no hard problem. And Daniel Dennett, one of the biggest physicalists, at least that I know of, dismisses that problem simply by saying that consciousness is an illusion. Well, as we said before, we can doubt the material world, but we can't doubt our minds. So obviously that's kind of self-refuting in a way. So yeah. Next, we're going, so now when people, okay, so we know physicalism is false, right? Okay, so people assume if physicalism is false, then that automatically means that dualism is true. Well, yeah, it's true in the sense that the mind is immaterial, but it's not true in the sense that, you know, the material, that matter necessarily has to be quote unquote physical, right? So this is kind of the viewpoint that you get from substance dualists, which is where you have the immaterial mind and the material brain. However, there's a problem, which is the interaction problem. Like I said before, this is what can deconverted me from Christianity and dualism. So how does an immaterial thing, such as the mind, have a material effect? If the mental can affect the physical, then the physical can affect the mental. Like if you damage your brain, you know, there's been studies where it'll change your personality or change the way you see the world, right? Well, if they can affect each other, they have to have a shared property, and so they cannot be separate substances. And, you know, if I'm going to move something, like if I move this computer, I'm doing that with a quote unquote material effect. But when it comes to the mind, if the mind's supposed to be immaterial, but the world is material, how does an immaterial thing have a material effect that's self-contradictory? So therefore, substance dualism is impossible, and only one substance can exist. Now, the next one we're going to go over is property dualism, which a few people have tried to run to this option to try to escape the philosophical implications, but there's an obvious way you can refute this. So if solipsism is conceivable, then the universe could exist such that only mind exists in a possible world, right? Okay, so therefore solipsism is conceivable. Like just think, only your mind exists, right? That's what solipsism is. Thus, the universe could exist with only one mind in it. I mean, that's basic logic. And then, of course, universes cannot only consist of properties or processes, but must also include entities and things for the properties to glue themselves onto. So, you know, if you can't have a universe where it's just properties or processes, you know, you have to have a processor or a substance to exist in order for those properties to glue themselves onto. And so ultimately, there is no difference between a solipsistic mind and the mind of the actual world. Like if you're sitting wherever you're watching this at, the only thing you can know for absolute certainty is that you exist. And from your perspective, I could be a figment of your imagination. Now, I don't want you to stop watching, of course, but just think, there is no difference between a solipsistic mind and the mind of the actual world. So thus, the mind cannot be a property or a process, but rather must be an entity. And so therefore, property dualism is false. So just the very fact that solipsism is possible makes it, in the fact that we can't, that there's no real difference between a solipsistic mind and the mind of our reality, proves that property dualism is obviously wrong. So this is the argument you get from all this, is the mind exists. I'm sure we can all agree on that. Premise 2, the properties of the mind are not that which matter can have, and you can prove this, as I did before, with the problems with physicalism and how the mind cannot be material, or it can't, matter cannot have mental, you know, the properties of the mind, matter simply cannot have mental properties. And then finally, premise 3, substance dualism is false, which is shown through the interaction problem. And therefore, the conclusion logically follows, all is mind. That is, I mean, I understand people try to get around this argument and try to argue against premise 2 or premise 3, or some people try to argue against premise 1. But that's not the issue. The issue is that these are problems that these are philosophical problems, and these problems prove that one, that the matter cannot have properties of the mind, and of course that substance dualism is logically impossible. And so when you take that all in together, the only logical conclusion left is that all is mind. That is the logical conclusion. So just want to move on. So atheism gets destroyed with his own lightsaber, because atheists always try to argue against dualism, and now since we've taken out physicalism, well, they have nowhere to run, essentially. So that's the model. Again, this is the same model you get from the philosophy part. Now we're going to move on to digital physics and quantum theory. So I'm going to present a case, not the full case, but I'm going to present a strong case for us living in a simulation. Materialism and dualism describe a clockwork universe with atoms in the void, which would be a real universe in a non. However, idealism describes a world based on information processing. And so computer scientist Brian Whitworth compared these two hypotheses to our physics to see which one better fits the data. So I'm going to give you a few examples. So one example is digital processing. So light is quantized as photons. Matter, time, and energy have a limited amount. So if you, at the subatomic scale, there's subatomic particles, and you cannot get any smaller than those subatomic particles. Now, in a video game, it's the same thing. You have pixels where, you know, there's always going to be, quote unquote, a smallest thing in that video game. Well, that's true for reality as well. The next example I'm going to give is there's a maximum speed. The speed of light is fixed, and nothing is shown to go faster. And so, again, in video games, there's always going to be a maximum speed. You know, you're not going to have an infinite amount of speed. You know, in a real universe, there shouldn't be a maximum speed, right? But it turns out in our universe, we do have a maximum speed. And so that would be evidence that we do live in a simulation, just as video games and whatnot have maximum processes, the universe does as well. And then finally, virtual reality creation, the Big Bang, the very fact that the universe is not eternal and had a beginning implies that it came from something else that is more fundamental. So matter is not fundamental, because if it was, it should be eternal, right? But it's obviously not. So, and then also we have non-locality, which is wave function collapse. The collapse of the wave function is non-local, as two particles from opposite sides of the universe affect each other instantly. Now, this seems very counterintuitive, right? I mean, we already have the maximum speed of light, but it turns out non-locality shows that two particles can interact regardless of how far they are. And this wouldn't make sense under a real material universe. In a real material universe, everything would be localized. Like, you know, particles would only affect the particles near it. But in our universe, it turns out it's the opposite, where particles can affect each other wherever they are. It doesn't matter. And so that would be evidence for us living in a simulation. And I want to also mention the fact that the no communication theorem shows that classical information cannot travel faster than the speed of light. So therefore, whatever is causing these non-local effects to happen in entanglement, they have to be happening underneath space-time. So that would imply that we live in a simulation. Next, identicals are identical in all respects. So subatomic particles have precise properties that are alike in all respects. So, you know, you have protons, neutrons, electrons. They're all pretty much the same. Like, they have the same properties, and it's almost like they were all copied for the same program. So in a program or a computer simulation, you have everything in that simulation has the same precise properties that are all the same. And it turns out in our universe, that's the case as well. And then probably one of the biggest pieces of evidence is time slowing near massive objects. So with this, so let's take an example of video games. If you open up too many screens, or if you download stuff into that game, if it's going to slow down your internet, right? Well, it turns out in our universe that's true as well. If you put too much stuff in one place, like black holes or big planets, it turns out time slows down near those objects. And so in general relativity, time slows down near massive objects. Just like in computer games, larger programs slow down a computer, right? I mean, if that's not evidence for us living in a simulation, I don't know what is. Anyways, and then finally, there's empty space, which isn't actually empty. Quantum fluctuations create virtual particles in the quantum vacuum. And so when physicists have discovered that there's no such thing as really empty space, because even in places that are quote unquote empty, there's actually virtual particles popping in and out of existence out of the quantum vacuum. And so there really is, in a real material universe, there should be quote unquote real empty space, but it turns out that's not actually the case. There's actually quantum fluctuations creating virtual particles all the time. So that would make no sense under a materialist universe, but of course this is what we find in physics. So now I'm going to quote Brian Whitworth. Individually, none of the above short points is convincing, but taken together they constitute what a court might call circumstantial evidence, favoring virtual reality against objective reality. When coincidences mountain up, they present a plausibility argument, if not a proof. More powerful evidence is provided by cases which a virtual reality explains easily, but which objective reality approaches have great difficulty with. So just taking these facts alone, the evidence strongly favors a virtual reality against an objective reality. And that's not even all the evidence either. I'm going to present more. Next, we have the holographic principle, the idea that our 3D universe emerges from 2D information processing. It is now considered one of the key principles for a theory of quantum gravity. And when it comes to quantum gravity research, that seems to be one of the things that they know for certain that is needed to create a theory of quantum gravity. Thus, a simulated universe best explains what the ultimate quantum gravity theory is describing. So I understand physicists are still trying to figure out how do you put together quantum mechanics and general relativity. And it turns out the simulated universe, it best explains this phenomena. So if quantum mechanics and general relativity, if these two theories are to exist in the same, if they're both to be true in our universe, well, it turns out the best theory to explain this would be the simulated universe. So again, very powerful evidence that we live in a simulation. The falsification of realism, which this has caused lots of controversy. So local realism was falsified in the 1980s. I think most physicists now accept that entanglement is a proven phenomena. But then also non-local realism was falsified in 2007. So realism is now dead, which would be, now for those wondering what realism is the belief that objects exist independent of observation, or in other words, to put it more precisely, objects exist in their physical appearance independent of observation. So when you're not, so if you're not looking at an object, it's still there in its physical appearance. Well, it turns out that was directly falsified in 2007. Now, many try to use loopholes to avoid the conclusion of realism being false, and we were going to go over those. So one of the major ones is macro realism, which basically says that the macro and micro world are separate. However, Leggett-Garg inequalities were violated. Thus, we're not going to go over the paper, but that's the paper right there if you want to go check it out later. But basically, macro realism was falsified. And then decoherence, which states that quantum effects stop at the macro level in decoherence and decoherent to classical physics. So they try to say that, oh well, yeah, there's quantum mechanics, but then it breaks into, well, the problem is this doesn't explain the Born rule, and it doesn't solve the measurement problem. So as Jones said, quote, thus decoherence solve the measurement problem? Clearly not. What decoherence tells us is that certain objects appear classical when they are observed. But what is an observation? at some stage, we still have to apply the usual probability rules of quantum theory. And then, as another physicist has said, decoherence arises from a direct application of the quantum mechanical formalization to a description of the interaction of a physical system with its environment. By itself, decoherence is therefore neither an interpretation nor a modification of quantum mechanics. So, yeah, you could say that decoherence avoids this, but again, that's kind of a non sequitur. And many physicists have concluded that decoherence does not solve the measurement problem. So, another final one that they try to do is there's quote unquote other interpretations of quantum mechanics. I'm not going to go over all of them. These are just the main three that I've heard of many of the years. But so the many worlds interpretation is unable to derive the Born rule because, you know, all probabilities happen under that interpretation. But of course, according to the Born rule, you know, it's not that they all equally happen. It's just some might happen more than others. But that the very fact that the many worlds violates this basic rule makes it less parsimonious than just the Copenhagen interpretation. We have also Bohemian mechanics, which violates special relativity by creating faster than light non-local hidden variables. Now, when it comes to this interpretation, there's been a lot of controversy. I'm not going to get into it as deep, but basically they try to hold to this Lorentzian relativity. But the only problem with that is it's ad hoc, and it's, you know, you're not going to, it's rejected by most physicists. And on top of that, what's wrong with it? And it requires these hidden variables that are, again, faster than the speed of light, which even under Lorentzian relativity, that would still be the case. And then finally, the GOW theories, which faces the tail problem, which I'm not going to go over. But basically, the idea is that solutions to this problem create more problems. So to conclude, again, I'm not going to go over all the interpretations. I might do that for another video series, but for now, I'm just going to say this about these interpretations. Realists have often responded to these criticisms of these interpretations, but they have to invent unfalsifiable physics to make their interpretations work, which lacks parsimony and violates Occam's razor. And so, you know, there's really no reason, logical reason, to hold to these interpretations. They're just doing it because they don't want realism to be false. So pretty much it. And therefore, we live in a virtual reality. That is the logical conclusion. I haven't even presented all the evidence. I mean, that is the basic evidence, but that is the with taking all this together, taking Brian Whitworth, the holographic principle, and the very fact that realism was falsified shows that we live in a virtual reality. And so, goodbye physical reality. We live in a simulation. Deal with it. This is, you know, this is science. This is not, like, what I'm saying here, this is not creationism. This is not pseudoscience. This is what science tells us. And so, yeah. Now, of course, so we do live in a simulation. Who are the simulators? If our universe is a simulation, should we just believe that we are programs in a computer? Well, there are problems with us being a computer, which we're going to go over. So we have the Qubit unpacking problem. So if we are being simulated on a computer, it can either be a classical computer or a quantum computer. If it's a quantum computer, their world would have to be based on qubits, meaning that they would have to be based on quantum mechanics, and thus all the evidence I just presented for the simulation theory would apply to this universe as well, implying that they are also a simulation. Now, a real universe, a non-simulated universe, would require a classical computer, and the issue is that classical computers are based on bits. And so if you want a quote-unquote real material universe, this universe would require just classical physics, and the computer itself would be based on bits, not qubits. And the issue is unpacking all of our qubits into bits requires a computer larger than a universe. And so if you want a quote-unquote real material universe to simulate our universe, well, you need a computer larger than their universe, which no one's going to, I mean, some people might argue for that, but that's kind of absurd. So yeah, we could be a simulation computer, but even if we were, their universe would also have to be simulated as well. So really the only logical option that we have is, I'm going to argue now, the digital physics argument. So premise 1, simulations can only exist in a computer or in a mind. Premise 2, the universe is a simulation. Now, of course, premise 2 is supported by all the evidence I just gave for it before. Premise 3, a simulation on a computer still must be simulated in a mind. Premise, sorry, I skipped, I said premise 4, I didn't mean, I meant to say premise 3. Anyways, premise 4, therefore the universe is a simulation in a mind. So premise 3 is supported by the Qubit unpacking problem, which we already showed that you get the whole picture, that if we're not simulating a computer, then we can only be simulating a mind. And this mind is what we call God, and therefore God exists. So if our universe is a simulation, then it logically follows that we are simulated in a mind. Because if we were simulating a computer, their computer would also have to be simulated, and so on and so on. So the only logical option to really hold to is that we're simulated in a mind. That is the logical option. So, I mean, I don't know any other ones. So. And so that pretty much destroys atheism right then and there. So, yeah. And so this is the model you get. You get the digital physics model. And so you have the quantum cognition and the, this, I guess, the simulator, and then you have the physical world, which is inside, which in fact is the same model we went over when we went over the philosophy part, and when we went over the Christian Neoplatonism. So again, you get the same model. You know, you can derive the same model from different perspectives. So, okay, so now we're going to get into the why. Well, okay, if God exists, why Christianity? You know, why did you come to accept Christianity after you deconverted? Well, there's actually a way you can derive Christianity from this. So if we are to accept that God exists, why Christianity? Why not Hinduism, Islam, Judaism? You know, well, first of all, theistic idealism rules out polytheistic religions and non-theistic religions because of its, so, you know, theistic idealism logically concludes with monotheism, which is the belief in only one God. And so the only religions that really have this, I think, are Islam and Judaism and Christianity. And so now most apologists take this into historical apologetics, but I can get Christianity directly from idealism. So we're going to go over that right now. So God is the good. So it is logically impossible for someone to be evil just to be evil. If it's logically impossible for someone to be evil just to be evil, then evil cannot exist on its own. Conclusion 1. Then therefore evil can't exist on its own. Premise 3. If it's logically impossible for evil to exist on its own, then evil is a perversion of good. I mean, that would logically follow. Premise 4. If evil is a perversion of good, the only good can exist on its own, and therefore only good can exist on its own. Now, the next premise is God has changed this. I think we can, at least most people can agree on that. And therefore God cannot turn from good to evil. So if God is eternal and he's changeless, then he must have been good first. And then on top of that, he can't change the evil. So it, you know, that's basic proof that he's good in a sense. Now, some people might object to the verse premise, but it is, I mean, we have no experience of someone being evil just to be evil. The closest we can get is cruelty. But in reality, people only cruelly gain something, such as power, pleasure, or safety. But these things are not evil. They are good to have, and the evil comes from pursuing them in the wrong motives or in the wrong way. And so when you examine evil as nothing more than the pursuit of something good in the wrong way. Now, unlike evil, you can be good just for the sake of being good, and you can act kind, even if it gives you no pleasure simply because it is the right thing to do. But no one can be cruel just to be cruel, or be cruel without gaining something good. So like C.S. Lewis says, in other words, badness cannot succeed even in being bad in the same way in which goodness is good. Goodness is, so to speak, itself. Badness is only a spoiled goodness, and there must be something good first before it can be spoiled. That's from C.S. Lewis. So, yeah. And then we have privational boning, which basically is the idea that evil is the absence of good and so forth. So, as I proved earlier, theistic idealism is true. God is good, and we all exist in the mind of God, right? I already presented evidence for that. And so what this means is that we all have value sets that are labeled as good or bad. Like, we could subjectively say that, oh, this person's good or bad and whatnot. Our sets of value, however, are contained in a larger mind, which would be God's mind. And since our minds are the product of God's mind, then our senses of value derive God's sense of value. And thus, God must also has a sense of value. God's sense of value is objective. So yes, it is subjective, but it is also universal, since his mind contains all of existence. God's sense of value must be universally intersubjective, since all value sets come from God's. What is universally intersubjective is epistemologically objective. So yeah, it is subjective, but it's not subjective in the sense that he's just declaring something good or bad just because. What it means by intersubjective is that we all have value sets, and somehow all these value sets are compatible or fit within God's value set. And so because of this, God's value set would be universal, and thus from everyone's perspective, or at least from his, whatever, he would be the one that is the quote-unquote objective moral compass, so to speak. So he would be the ground of morality under this. And since God's value set is universal, then God is the good out of logical necessity. If we start at the beginning, we have one mind with one value set. And given what I showed before, this value set is universally good and perfect. This good God causes a good creation. Since under theistic idealism, nothing can exist outside of God's mind, then evil would only exist as an absence of the good, absence of God, and a separation or break in the original design. So the mind that causes this break would exist in God's mind, but they would be disconnected for the rest of God's mind. And so therefore the explanation of value sets is that they are different to God's value set, and this difference is explained in the ego, or the fallen state, which is how we get sin and whatnot. So we'll go over that next. So the ego is the separation of God from sin because of our sin. All religions teach, now what I'm about to say, this applies to all religions. This is the whole point of religion in the first place. All religions teach that there is something wrong with mankind, and it's commonly referred to as our ego, fallen state, where we are not aligned with God's value set. The ego is fundamentally separate from God, in which our value sets are different than God's value set. However, all the religion's goals, like the whole point of religion in the first place, is to escape this fallen state, to be saved or for salvation, and to go into the holy state, connection to God, where our value sets are the same as God's value set. I mean, that's pretty much the whole goal of religion in the first place. So now we're going to go over different models of salvation, which different ways religions try to escape this. So we have the religious model, which is found in Islam, Judaism, and many others. It's based on legalism, which focuses on external works. However, the issue, of course, is that God isn't involved in this salvation. It's just done within state or ego. So that doesn't. You're doing works, but you're not getting closer to God, because you're still, it's like trying to fix a car with only half its parts. It's focused on external works. You're trying to do good things, but you're all doing that within your ego. So it's not fixing the ego, right? So you're kind of stuck in this ego under this model. The next model is the Eastern model. Works to prepare the soul, upwards flight to the soul. So there's two stages, basically. So as I said before, the works of the soul and the upwards flight to the soul, to God. This is found in Hinduism, Buddhism, New Age, basically most Eastern religions. Like if you go to India or parts of China, or, basically just, Now, this is not salvation by works in the classical sense, but its works are used to prepare a soul for second stage, which focuses on spiritual development rather than external actions. However, stage 2 is still done within the ego. So yeah, it's a little bit better than the religious model, but it still doesn't solve the problem. Like it doesn't accomplish the religion's goal in the first place. So yeah, it's not salvation by works, so to speak, but when it comes to the second stage, it's you're still doing it within the ego, so it still faces that problem. Which is next, the Christian model. Now, the Christian model is unique to Christianity. It focuses on inner transformation rather than external works. Now, unlike the Eastern model, Christian model says God initiates the transformation rather than the ego. So instead of the ego doing it, like all the other religious models go by, it's God changing you. And so it's the whole we can't change ourselves thing. So apart from me, you cannot do anything. And so salvation is a gift to fix ego rather than the ego trying to fix itself. You know, the whole point of religion in the first place is to, quote unquote, save us from sin or whatever they might not call it sin, but how it's defined within each religion is pretty much the same thing. You know, so under the Christian model, it's not the ego that fixes it, it's God that fixes it. And so this pretty much solves the problem. So the ego, and the reason why, okay, this is the really important part. The reason why the ego cannot fix itself is because of privational boning. And so our ego is separate from God, so it's broken and only God can fix it, since evil must be fixed from outside itself rather than from within itself. God does not have ego, but he has an identity separate from us. What causes / defines a separation is sin, our choosing of privation. So that's the whole point of, you know, being in the ego or fallen state. And so only the Christian model can fix this ego we have within us. Because in the reason why the Christian model can only fix our ego is because our ego can't fix ourselves. So only God can do it. And so that would make more sense. So how does God save us from ego? Well, God has to die to his own identity in separation from us, even though he has no privation of his own. For the death that he died to sin once and for all, but the life that he lives to God. For all that's left for us after he already died on the cross and he came back from the dead. So all that's left for us is to die to our own egos. So consider yourselves to be dead to sin, but alive to God, Jesus Christ. So then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their crosses to follow me. So you basically have to kill your ego. So connection to God. So once you accomplish this, connection to God is restored. And then good works follow as a result of the changed character, but are not the point. The point of Christianity is to allow God to get close to us. The point of Christianity is not to do all these works or do all these spiritual practices, but rather allow God to get close to us. And then the works that we do is a result of our salvation. So it's the salvation that precedes the works rather than the works preceding the salvation. Right? And then so why Christianity? Well, only the Christian model can work with theistic idealism because, you know, the whole ego thing and how God can, you know, if God's good, like I showed before, and if he wants to save, then it would logically follow he would want to save us, and the only way he can do that is through the Christian model. And so since it's necessary God is the good and we want to fix our egos, he can do it through the Christian model because of the whole, you know, you can't fix, you know, the ego can't fix itself, right, because of privational boning. And so the other religions models fail in fixing the ego, since they are based on fixing your own corrupt ego rather than and I'm actually going to show you Donald Trump in a minute. There it is. So this is actually quite hilarious. People love me because I have transcended my ego. I transcend egos better than anyone else. You'll never meet anyone who has transcended their ego better than me. So obviously this is wrong. You can't transcend your ego, because if you did, you would be going into your ego anyways. So this basically shows that, yeah, you're trying to fix your ego, but at the same time, you're doing that through your ego, which means you can't save yourself. Essentially, you have to have an external savior, and this external savior would be God, that saves you from the ego. If you want to align to God in the first place, God is the one that has to save you, not you trying to save yourself. So once I figured out this model theistic idealism exactly parallels with Christianity, I realized Christianity derives directly from this model. So if theistic idealism is true, which I've shown in this presentation, then Christianity is also true. And so if Christianity is true, then Jesus is God, and the Bible is the Word of God. And so if you want to know what reality, if you want to be saved, you have to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And so, after, of course, I've had a better understanding of what God wanted me to understand from the start and his relation to the world. So the point is to get, the whole point of this presentation is to give you my testimony, of course, of how we converted to Christianity. And I hope you all like my ideas of theistic idealism and accept it as true. The choice is yours. Hold to theistic dualism like I once did, or convert to theistic idealists. I know most apologists try to argue from the historical side, which is fine. I do sometimes as well. But there is a way you can derive Christianity from this metaphysical model. And so that's kind of the whole point. If you want to get more detail, I did a video with Johanna Ratz a few weeks ago, I think. We were talking about religious pluralism, and he kind of went into detail how that all worked. So you can watch that video as well. Okay, so if you want more information, again, Johanna Ratz and Inspiring Philosophy, the links are in the description. You can go check out those channels, and that's it. I hope you all enjoyed watching, and I hope that you could all understand my presentation, and I hope that you can really think about idealism and why exactly I converted. Again, this presentation was not all the evidence. I didn't even give all the arguments for idealism. So those are just kind of the two arguments that I decided to use. But I hope you all enjoyed watching. God bless you all, and happy Thanksgiving. So see you guys later.